Hi, welcome back to Storyline. In this video we will summarize one of the films entitled The 100-Foot Journey, released on 2014. Prepare your snack, set a comfortable position, and let's get into the storyline of the film. The film opens by showing a child who is invited by his mother to buy sea urchins at the Mumbai Indian traditional market. This child is named Hassan. He is the main chef of his family-owned restaurant that has been passed down from his great-grandfather. Hassan has a father named Mr. Kadam, who is the owner of the restaurant. Hassan gained knowledge about cooking from his mother, who acted as a direct instructor in providing secret spices to make his cooking more delicious. But one night, the restaurant was forced to close due to riots due to political tensions. People barged in and set fire to Mr. Kadam's restaurant. And not only lost a restaurant, Hassan also lost his mother, who was a victim in the riots. After that incident, Hassan and his family moved to England to seek refuge there. They bought a simple house and opened a small restaurant. But unfortunately their restaurant is empty of visitors because of the less strategic location and close to the flight path. Because their conditions were getting more difficult, they finally decided to move to France. While on the way, suddenly their car brakes didn't work properly, causing panic all the passengers, but fortunately near the descent there was a rescue lane, so they avoided an accident. They then rested for a while at the edge of the garden. Not long after, a woman named Margaret, who was sympathetic, came to see them all. Margaret is an assistant chef at a luxury restaurant called Soul Labor belonging to Mrs. Mallory. Margaret took Mr. Kadam's family to her house and entertained them with very delicious French food. Next, Margaret advised them to stay at a hotel in St. Antonio as a temporary place to stay. In the morning, Mr. Kadam and Hassan took a walk to see the village and stumbled upon an empty restaurant that was being sold. Mr. Hassan was intrigued and went in to see what was inside. This caught the attention of Mrs. Mallory, the person who lived opposite the restaurant. Mallory was the owner of the Soul Labor restaurant, which was directly opposite the empty restaurant. Mr. Kadam says if he wants to buy that restaurant. But Mrs. Mallory's expression reflected her distaste for Mr. Hassan and Kadam. Seeing this, Hassan asked his father to leave the place, but his father refused and insisted on making an offer to Mrs. Mallory. The next day, Mr. Kadam got a call from the owner of the empty restaurant. The owner allowed Mr. Kadam to buy the restaurant, and finally the restaurant was bought by Mr. Kadam. The following days, Mr. Kadam's family was busy cleaning up the restaurant and preparing the restaurant for its opening night. The restaurant was named Maison Mumbai. One day, when Hassan went to the market, he accidentally met Margaret, and Hassan asked a few things about French cuisine, as well as the Michelin star. The Michelin star is a star award and also a classification for restaurants in France. All restaurants chase the star as pride and recognition for their restaurant. On the other hand, Mrs. Mallory, who is not happy with the establishment of the restaurant, continues to monitor the extent to which her rival restaurant is built. Not only Mallory, who does not like the presence of the restaurant, Jean, the main chef at Mrs. Mallory's restaurant, didn't like the new restaurant either. The day before the opening of Maison Mumbai, Mr. Kadam is promoting his restaurant with confidence in various places with a special 50% discount on the premiere night. Then the next morning, when Hassan and Mr. Kadam went shopping at the market, it turned out that the main ingredients for their menu had sold out. It turned out that all the ingredients had been bought by Mrs. Mallory with the aim of destroying the opening of Mr. Kadam's restaurant. Knowing this, Mr. Kadam was furious and declared war on Mrs. Mallory. Kadam and Hassan finally went to another market and bought alternative ingredients for their cooking. Long story short, the first opening of the restaurant started by presenting an Indian atmosphere, but after hours Mr. Kadam waited. None of the customers came. Mr. Kadam then changed his clothes to typical Indian clothes, including sending his daughter to welcome customers. Unexpectedly, it turns out that this method has succeeded in attracting customers to come to the restaurant. The visitors to Mr. Kadam's restaurant are getting busier day by day, and this worries Mrs. Mallory because now her restaurant is starting to be competitive. Mrs. Mallory reported Mr. Kadam's restaurant to the mayor on charges of causing noise because Mr. Kadam's restaurant was playing loud music. One morning, Hassan, who was fishing in the river, met Margaret again. They chatted again and Hassan asked Margaret how to make French food. Furthermore, Margaret said that Hassan should be able to make 5 basic sauces, namely bechamel, velouté, hollandaise, tomate, and espagnole. After that, Hassan immediately made and asked Margaret to taste it. Voila. And really unexpectedly, Hassan's sauce was extraordinarily delicious. Not long after, the mayor came to Mr. Kadam's restaurant to mediate the report from Mrs. Mallory. Mr. Kadam agrees with the mayor's suggestion, but he will not stop the drums of war on Mrs. Mallory. One day, Mrs. Mallory's restaurant will have a minister and will entertain her guests with a special menu of pigeons and truffle sauce. But when Mrs. Mallory was shopping at the market, the pigeons had been bought out by someone. As it turned out, it was a counterattack from Lord Kadam. Knowing this, Hassan, who did not like his father's behavior, came to Mrs. Mallory's restaurant with a pigeon dish complete with truffle sauce. Not to forget, he also apologized for his father's behavior. Then Mrs. Mallory tasted Hassan's cooking. But the food was immediately thrown in the trash. Behind the restaurant, Mrs. Mallory thought, because she had lied about what she had tasted, it turned out to be very delicious. Since then, the trade war between the two restaurants has been getting fiercer. Until one night, Mr. Kadam's restaurant wall was vandalized by swearing words. Not only that, Molotov were pelted at his restaurant and Hassan was injured. The incident makes Mallory sympathetic and suspicious of one of his men named Jean. Because of his behavior, Mrs. Mallory finally fired Jean. Not only that, Mrs. Mallory also cleaned the walls of Mr. Kadam's restaurant. Hassan, who was in the room, saw Mrs. Mallory, then invited her to come in to taste his omelet. Mrs. Mallory was in tears, for it was the first time she had such a delicious omelet. He was also finally honest that Hassan's truffle sauce pigeon the other day was delicious. And he plans to offer Hassan to join her restaurant. Long story short, the next day, Hassan finally moved to the Soul Labor restaurant, and since then the relationship between Mr. Kadam and Mrs. Mallory began to improve. Hassan cooks various dishes and makes new innovations in Soul Labor cuisine. Until one day, the restaurant returned to the minister. Hassan was trusted to prepare a menu of pigeons with truffle sauce. Unexpectedly, in the group there was a food critic as well as an agent from Michelin. A few days later, Mrs. Mallory received a call from the Michelin side informing them that the restaurant was awarded the Michelin star for the second time. To everyone's delight, the restaurant had waited 30 years to get its second star. Hassan's achievement, which managed to get a Michelin star in a short time, made him get offers from various restaurants that wanted to get a similar star. Hassan then moved to a more luxurious restaurant in Paris. He continued to make culinary innovations which made him frequent in magazines and television. On the other hand, Mr. Kadam and Mrs. Mallory's relationship is getting better and they spend a lot of time together. Although various achievements, fame, and luxury have been obtained, Hassan did not feel happy. Especially after tasting the Indian dishes brought by his friend, Hassan made him miss home even more. Finally, Hassan decided to return to St. Antonio to return to work with Margaret at Soul Labor. Mrs. Mallory gave full management of Soul Labor to Hassan and Margaret. And the film closes with Hassan promising to get his third Michelin star at the restaurant. Thank you for those of you who have watched to the end. Don't forget to like, comment and subscribe. See you in the next video.